تحضر على أي جهاز بدك إياه، شو ما بدك وإمتى ما بدك. كلن بس $99 بدون ما تشترك، وفيك تكمل أو توقف لما بدك. اتصل هلأ على 1-300-976-481.
Are you looking for a professional and trustworthy migration team? Contact Dr. Fadi Kutub and his team at Lionheart Migration. Lionheart Migration specialises in migration, education and coaching advice and services. The team can assist with your visa, citizenship and education inquiries and applications, and with your migration tribunal and court matters. With a proven record of successful visa applications and appeals, our expert and honest team is ready to help. For all your inquiries, contact us on 02 9299 0112. You can also visit the Lionheart Migration website and social media platforms. John's Quality Meat for all your occasions. Everyday fresh Cowra free-range lamb meat. For all your orders, call us on 02 9631 7216 or visit one of our Sydney locations, Shop 85 Victoria Road, Parramatta, or Shop 530 Marylands Road, Marylands. Honesty and cleanliness is our motto. George's Building Supplies Fire Doors and Frames is a proud family-owned Australian business supplying building products for over 45 years. As we continue to grow, we have made it our mission to provide our clients consistent quality, safety, and the highest level of service, reliability, and expertise in the industry. Whatever the project, big or small, we take care of everything frames and doors. With experience across over 100 projects, our track record speaks for itself. Contact GBS today for all your door and frame needs on 9624 1283 or email us on info@gbsfiredoors.com.au.
Old Time Bakery is proud to announce the release of the first gluten-free Lebanese bread to hit the market, specializing in gluten-free wraps and pizza bases. For more information, please contact Old Time Bakery on 9708 4442 or visit their website on www.oldtimebakery.com.au. The Voice of Charity would like to thank our current sponsors for their ongoing support. And if you would like to become one of our sponsors, please contact the Voice of Charity office on 9625 6111 or email us on voc@voc.org.au.
علمتينا المحبة، سمعتينا حد علمتينا المحبة، بتخافي من هبوب الريح، عن حبك ما رح ننسيح، بتخافي من هبوب الريح، عن حبك ما رح ننسيح، صوتك من صوت المسيح، تبقي صوت المحبة.
Do you see Good evening, listeners. Voice of Charity. This is Joseph Wakim, the first ever episode of Cast the Net, which was the song that you've just heard. Really pleased to be here, and we start with a blessing, and we hope that the Holy Spirit guides this conversation. Some of you might remember me co-hosting a program with a dear friend, Shadi Haj Hajar. It was called Kanzuka Haythu Kalbuka. We were here in the studio live every Friday for about 12 months up until September. And this is the first time that we're actually doing the program, or I'm doing the program totally in the English language, especially on behalf of people who were raised in Australia when we were very young. I remember the Arabic masses were for the adults and the English language masses were for the kids. But what happens 40 years later when those children have become parents or grandparents like me? And so English is still a language that a lot of us older Christians still use, but I would love to keep nourishing and promoting the Arabic language in our conversations. For 1 hour per fortnight, this new series will cast the net, taking a deep dive into the true stories of inspirational Christians, especially us Catholics. The series is curious about how the Holy Spirit has been a lamp when we have experienced a dark tunnel. As we cast the net and go fishing together, my prayer is that iron sharpens iron. Tonight, we ask a very simple question. Why do we say, "Dear Lord, please give me a sign"? I am at the crossroads, but I don't know which way to turn. It could be a family relationship, choosing the right medical treatment, choosing the right spouse, choosing a new career, choosing a new home, choosing to reach out to someone who's rejected you. Lord, I have tried the logical. I have drawn the line in the middle of the page and jotted down the cons and the pros. I've tried the natural and listened to the good old-fashioned gut instinct without overthinking. I've tried seeking advice and asked for those with trusted opinions who say, "Well, if I were you, I would." I've prayed, I've fasted, but I'm still unclear and worried that I'm going to regret a wrong decision. So, do I seek the supernatural and ask God for a sign? Many have mocked the idea of seeking a sign from above. In the 1979 Monty Python British black comedy, Life of Brian, the disoriented and desperate fellows are so hungry for any sign from any Messiah that they grab his fallen shoe and hold it up. The shoe is a sign. Skeptics mock the sign seekers and trivialize each sign as a coincidence. So tonight, the topic will be something we can all relate to. Discernment. What is discernment? The original meaning of the word, coming from Latin, dis meant apart, and corner means to separate. So it was originally like discernment. So it's something to do with separating and knowing the difference between something that is of God and something that is not. It's like the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, what is that difference? Indeed, tonight, we are seeking the wisdom to know that difference. As a compass and a guide to navigate our way in this desert, we have, let's call him an abbot, a Benedictine abbot from the deserts of Ballarat, Victoria. His name is Dennis Nichols. Dennis, so pleased to have him on the program. For 45 years, Dennis has hosted and coordinated many spiritual retreats for individuals and groups who seek solace and silence, reconnection with the Creator and with creation. Dennis has qualifications in theology, education, and social work. He tries to hold up that lamp and help people ask probing questions when they're at the crossroads. Dennis, welcome as our first guest on Cast the Net, and welcome to Voice of Charity.
Thank you, Joe.
That's great. Look, Dennis, for listeners who don't know much about the Benedictine way of life, can you please shed light on who was Saint Benedict and why his way became your way, when you could easily have become a Franciscan or Augustine or Jesuit. Why Benedict?
Joe, probably have to clear up first in terms of lay movement. So if we're talking about lay Benedictines, the Jesuits have lay movements and secular movements with the Franciscan. So it means you're not living in a religious community per se, but you're connected either, with Benedictines, we're connected as oblates to a monastery or to our own community, to our own sort of family setting. So that's what I'm involved in. Benedict himself, what attracted me to it was, Benedict lived from about 480 to about 560 AD, and that was a time of turmoil in the Roman Empire, an extraordinary time of turmoil, actually. And as you know, the Roman Empire didn't finish overnight. It took years and years to be demolished. And during that time, Benedict noticed an increase of poverty, enormous amount of suffering. And one of his responses was to simply gather a few people together. Benedict himself was a layman. Gather a few people together and say, well, let's see if we can't get sort of a farm setting going and get a routine, prayer and work is one of the Benedictine mottos, so that we can sort of get a lifestyle that's stable, a lifestyle that's listening to God, and through helping and assisting one another through community, we're also able to help the poor, give something to others, and live simply. So it wasn't as simple as the, say, Franciscans later on, but it certainly was a structured setting in the face of turmoil. And of course, the world goes through so much turmoil. So these sorts of movements have stayed, that's over 1,500 years now. It's sort of proved itself, really. So one of the things that attracted me, the three main things, Benedictines don't take the same sort of vows as other religious orders. So the only one that's similar is what's called obedience. But the other two vows are what's called conversatio and stability. And I'll just briefly explain those because that might make a bit more sense of why I chose to become part of the Benedictine way. So obedience, as the first one, obedience comes from the Latin word obede, which means to listen. And really that's the key. That's the beginning of his little rule. His rule's very small, very easy to read. And the beginning of that is listen. Listen to the Master, it says. Listen to the Lord. Listen. And it really is our stance that we should take in everything, which is even what we're looking at tonight when we're looking for a sign. We're actually listening, being attentive to, opening our heart to, like a hospitality of the heart. We're attentive. So Jesus was obedient unto death. His obedience was listening to the Father and responding to that, and the response to that was obviously through his life. Conversatio is an interesting one. It's hard to, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, Joe. It's hard to find the right English word for that, so they keep it as a Latin name, conversatio, which basically means a commitment to change. So while we're staying the same, we still change, and of course, all change requires growth, or growth requires change.
So Dennis, with that conversatio really sounds more like conversion than conversation.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard. Go on, Joe, sorry.
Yeah, it sounds more like a conversion than a conversation.
It's neither, and that's why it's hard for them to get the right word.
Okay.
They stick to the Latin one. So it looks like conversation without the N on the end, but conversatio is what they hold on to. And it's really important because it's saying, not that we want to stay in one particular space, we're always listening and therefore always growing. So we're also changing. It's a curious vow. And the third one is stability. So they all tie into one another. Stability. One of the keys to stability is that, as you know, in our lifestyle, people pick and choose and move from one place to the other. Benedict was very cautious of that. He used to call that sort of behaviour gyrovagues, which meant people that sort of followed around their own tastes and didn't have time to grow. They just sort of went from one group to the other group to the other. Whereas he was saying in his monasteries, you need stability. And I think it's really true that when you're with a group of people and you stay with a lifetime, doesn't mean you have to be planted in the same place, but stay within the same community. People will tell you your flaws and they'll tell you your strengths. You'll have an opportunity to grow. But a lot of people, if they've been told their flaws, will move on to another community. So never get a chance to grow. So that's kind of Benedict, the wisdom of Benedict, his way is saying, well, let's be stable, let's be committed to one another, let's grow where we are, let's be obedient, listen to each other and listen to the Lord, and let's be prepared to change, to grow and to be open to change. So that's the essential elements of his vows.
Look, thanks for laying out the ground, Dennis. That's really important, because I think for a lot of our listeners, they may not know a lot about the Benedictine way and the various monasteries and abbeys that exist in Australia and around the world that, as you say, after 1,500 years, still follow this very stable way, sometimes in a very rough, choppy sea. And in fact, probably because it gets so choppy, it becomes more attractive. Dennis, you're in a fairly unique position, having, I suppose, borne witness and supported and listened to hundreds of people at the crossroads in their life, sometimes in a crisis. I don't know, those words are connected. But one of the things that is sometimes intriguing when people say, look, I'm at this turning point, I don't know whether to stay or go, I don't know whether to make this decision or that, the advice they often get is go and pray about it. And some people find that really confusing. What does it mean when someone is told to go and pray about it?
Well, I think I'd go back to that second part of the vow, listen. It really is obedience to God. When you say you're going to pray about it, you're actually going to be in the presence of God. One of the great sayings when people, I read it not so long ago again, and you'll have people who say, oh, I found God. And also the response, or the Benedictine response is, no, you actually were still long enough for God to find you. You could hear, you could get your attention. That's the thing. So many people are so busy, they don't allow their heart to be attentive to God. So the process really of listening is being attentive to God. And really, if your whole lifestyle is around listening and about prayer and about focusing, then when it comes to major decisions, you'll hear those small voices. You'll understand the movement. So therefore, you do turn to prayer anyway.
I love how you said the small voices, because the old biblical movies, Dennis, when we were younger, when we were kids, God was always a big voice. He was thundering down, and Noah would be cowering, or Moses would be cowering somewhere, looking up in awe and fear. So I'd like to get back to this issue of the small voice that can sometimes seem to be drowned out. Look, we're probably in good company when we talk about seeking a sign, because we know from our Bible that Moses did, David did, Gideon did. So it can't be something that is unfamiliar. When we are confused or desperate, we go out looking for a sign. I'll just give you one quick quote here from David in Psalm 86. Bend down, O Lord, and hear my prayer. Answer me, for I need your help. Look down and have mercy on me. Give your strength to your servant. Send me a sign of your favor. Then those who hate me will be put to shame for you. O Lord, help and comfort me. And there are many similar quotes in the Bible. However, what's interesting, Dennis, is that in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, it says, you should not put the Lord your God to the test. We must not subject the Lord to trial. Is asking a sign, especially with a timeline, not breaking that rule? And how do we discern between those two quite different Bible verses?
That's a good question, Joe. Thanks. I think one of the, just going back to the small voice might be another example. When we look at Elijah, for instance, when Elijah, do you remember when he had with the Baal priests, he was on the mountain and he challenged them if their God would light the bull on the altar, or whether Yahweh would, and there was about 400 of them. And at any rate, so he tells them to go first. They go first because Israel had really gone away from the Lord. And they jump around. He says, why don't you cut yourself a bit more? Maybe your God's asleep, you know. So they do that and they scream and shout louder and nothing happens. And then he steps forward and puts water over it and calls on Yahweh, and of course the bull is decimated. Then he turns on the priests and has them executed, for want of a better word, really. So his enthusiasm was massive. But then straight after that, Jezebel was still after him. And he felt that God had let him down, that maybe he'd misread the sign, really. Goes into the desert, and it's very subtle, the words at that stage in the desert, because it kind of suggested he was going to commit suicide. He went off, he decided not to eat, he goes under a tree, and for days on end he's not consuming anything, he's had enough, he just thinks God's abandoned him. God sends an angel just to give him enough to get on, a scone and some water, and then you know the text where he travels into the mountains then. And as he goes into the mountain and goes into the cave, God says that he was going to become present to him. And he had the earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. The mountain shook, God wasn't in the mountain. There was the storm, God wasn't in the storm. The lightning wasn't there. And then there's that still, small wind or silent voice, and that's where God was. And from that, really, the Carmelite tradition took up, because that's what they see Elijah as being very important, is being still and listening for that small voice. So God does give signs. I guess it gets back to our definition of what a sign is too, isn't it? For some of us, a sign would be pointing the way. If you come to the end of the street, you're looking for a sign. It will point you in a particular direction, and it has a use just for that. Sometimes I think when we use the analogy of getting a sign from God, for some reason, I think in our language, we tend to think it's going to be miraculous. There's really, there can be small nudgings, there can be fairly large expressions of it, but more often than not, there's really just a movement of your spirit, or what we would call, obviously, discernment. St. Ignatius was good on pointing towards consolation and desolation, and that's the movement of consolation is being very aware of God's presence. Desolation, it's not decimation, it's desolation. Desolation is when we feel away from God at the time.
So Dennis, one of the most common examples I see, and I'll pose the question, then we might go for a short break, so at least you've got time to digest it. But one of the common scenarios is, I've met someone who I think I could spend the rest of my life with. We're going to probably get married, but I'm just not sure, and I'm looking for a sign. And the other one is a career change, and there's a job that's offering, and I just don't want to make the wrong decision. And they do all the right things, like I said in the introduction, but now they're looking for something else, and they grab it with both hands, get very excited, and say, this is it. This is the confirmation I'm looking for, and I am now really at peace that this is what I'm looking for. Their friends would say, yeah, but it could just be a coincidence. It could be just your ego and your enthusiasm and your imagination.
Right. Well, I think that's where we really need to apply the Ignatian method, really.
Yeah.
Especially on major decisions. And more often than not, it's not imagination. The closer you are to the Lord, the more you sense it. And when I say the closer you are, the more that you're praying and listening and being attentive, the more that you'll sense in your spirit. Some people are really good at that. Others, they have a desire, or there's a great expression, the ego drama or the theodrama. And I've heard of that one. The ego drama means I'm at the centre of everything and what I want, and I make things work around me, and hopefully God fits into that plan. The theodrama, obviously, theo, coming from the word for God. Theodrama means that God's at the centre, and that we're working around that. And so we're listening and being attentive to God. It's usually quite different. So the way one goes to make decisions will also depend on whether your life's an ego drama or a theo drama. Don't know if that answers you. I mean, just pondering with you. I don't know if I can really answer your question.
Now, look, I don't expect an answer, but I do think that we'll have a short break in a second, but I do think it's one of the recurring quandaries that we humans come through when we are seeking a decision, seeking through prayer guidance, and then we have all these messages, and we go back to that word, Dennis, discernment. We need to go back and say, which one is God? Which one is just my imagination? And how do we know the difference? Maybe we'll just hang with that thought for a sec, and we'll come back just after a short break. And we're back to Cast the Net with Joseph Wakim and a special guest, Denise Nichols, tonight. We're looking at that age-old question. Why do we ask for a sign when we're at the crossroads? Why do we ask the Lord to give us a sign? Dennis, you're still with us, of course?
Yes.
Beautiful. Dennis, thanks again for being with us. And we're going to delve a little bit deeper now and using another really important quotation from the Gospels. You'd obviously be aware that in the Gospel of Mark chapter 8, just after Jesus performs the miraculous sign, multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, it reads, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Now, already that doesn't make sense. Like, he's just given them this phenomenal sign, and they're asking for a sign. And Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And, you know, in another version, I think it's in Matthew, it
Yeah,
talks
it's in
about except
Matthew.
the sign of Jonah. So you've got this sort of balancing act that we have, that on one hand, yes, the greats of the gospel, the greats of the Bible have looked up and sought a sign from God. And yet on the other hand, Jesus is saying, be careful, don't test me, don't give me these sorts of quandaries and tests. That's almost what Satan did to Jesus in the desert, is it not?
Yes, yes, it is.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Dennis has gone quiet on me.
Sorry, Joe. There you go. Yeah, it is. It is similar, though. I think when you talk about Matthew,
Yep.
Gospel of Matthew, there he does refer to the prophet Jonah as a sign, and of course that's referring to his own self. 3 days in the belly of the whale, and therefore Jesus was 3 days in the earth before the resurrection. That was fairly strong. But one of the things that Jesus was always careful of, you find it in Mark too, it's called the Messianic secret. He actually doesn't want people to come to him just because of his signs. You know, there are movements around that attract people because they do healings, or there's a very strong focus on signs, really, and we as humans like that. Jesus didn't want that. It was much more a personal experience. So when you look at the healings, even in the last few weeks through the Gospels that we've been having in the services, we've been looking at Bartimaeus and healings with individual people. Jesus takes them aside, and he often, even the rich young man, he steadily looks at him one-on-one. So he doesn't give him a sign. Even with Bartimaeus, he's very gentle with Bartimaeus. He asks him, well, what do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
And, most would say, well, that's pretty obvious. But it wasn't for Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus wanted to respond to him personally. And so both Bartimaeus and the rich young man, and they're not signs for everybody else to see. And even there was a good analogy made recently. I remember listening to Jesus coming back after the resurrection, and the commentator was saying, well, what would you have done if it was your first day back and after the resurrection? What would you expect Jesus to have done? And he said, if it was me, maybe I would have gone and shown myself to Caiaphas, or gone to the temple and showed the Romans what you've done. But he didn't. He didn't. Those signs weren't important. It had to be from the heart. It had to be with the people who desired to follow him. And he spends most of the day walking with what appears to be two fairly unknown people on the way to Emmaus. One of them's Clopas, which, as you know, Clopas was St. Joseph's brother. And the other could well have been, they say, St. Luke, because he refers very clearly in his own gospel about the event that happened at that time. But for most of the day, he spends the time with them, and then reveals himself, obviously, in the Eucharist, which we could say is a sign, an incredible sign, really, which was a sign both of his death, resurrection, and his presence with us now, and the real presence in the Eucharist itself.
See,
and then he disappears, because the sign of the Eucharist and his presence in the Eucharist was enough. He himself didn't need to be there, and obviously he goes back and appears to the apostle. So there are instances, but he's not a showman when it comes to the gospel. He attends to the people's needs. So maybe that's saying something about the sort of signs. Maybe we are culpable of constantly looking around for the great and the out of the ordinary events, and maybe people go to a lot of settings and so that they can see healings, or they're wonderful in themselves, but they're secondary. That, as Jesus says, it's the heart that he's after, to really seek him with all your heart. That's how I see it, anyway.
I love the reference to the heart, Dennis, because I think it just gives such a beautiful lens that washes over so many of the gospel stories and links them. If you take out the heart, they can become quite academic and intellectual exercises. You've got to bring the heart back in, because Jesus was compassionate, Jesus wept, Jesus paused for people that were perhaps unseen. They were hiding in the tree or tugging at his garment or whatever the case might be. One of the challenges, I suppose, Dennis, with this conversation is that I keep going back to biblical stories and biblical references, and yet our listeners are probably more interested in the here and now. How do we seek these? Maybe signs isn't even the right word, but why do we seek these messages, nudges, small voices from within? Do you think that there's a greater need for that because we're living in a world that's become more noisy? There's more clutter. There's more people saying, listen to me. And that's why we need to retreat and escape and tune in to that smaller voice from the bigger being.
It's quite possible. I would say people have always looked for some signs, throughout the generations. That would be fairly true to say. There's no question that there's too much clutter that's going on around us in our own experiences now. So we do need to remove some of the clutter to get to the essence of our own heart and our own spirit. That's for sure. That's why I think that the Church in her wisdom, invites people to do retreats, to have quiet time. I've noticed in a lot of places too, the holy hours have really taken off. I was actually at one this evening, and the numbers there are just incredible. People just want to, whether it's just to be still and silent and listen, and then benediction at the end of it. There's a lovely blessing to be had in that. I think it's probably a bit of that goes on, about that need for clarity, that if you've got a question, you Google it and you get an answer. I suppose people want God to be the same sort of character, that we ask God and he'll tell us what we need to do, and that'll be the sign. But he kind of doesn't work that way most times. He works with us and works through us. So there are times when decisions are really, there's no decision to be made. It's really clear. People know in their own heart. As Ignatius points out, that if you're making a decision, it has to be at least between two goods. You can't make a decision between something that's good and something that's not. That's a no-brainer. But the other thing is that there are some things that are incredibly clear to us that we don't have to make a decision on. We just know it's the right thing to do. And that people might say, well, that's a sign. I didn't have to. It's not necessarily a sign. It's kind of where the heart's attentive and focused, and we're able to move forward with that. And there are some things that are just really, I think you brought up to there, the marriage and the career change, that are much more life-oriented. So we're looking there at vocational things, and vocational things are really significant because it's obviously a commitment of your lifestyle. And as Christians, we want to commit our lifestyle completely to the Lord and serve the Lord. And so we need to be able to put it through the filter of his presence, which is obviously through prayer, but also guidance, maybe go on a retreat. If it's a serious, I would be very surprised if people treated marriage or career change flippantly, that most people would be really worried that they make a right decision. There are also, I have noticed over the years, there are times when God kind of, trying to find the right word for it, supports us in our decision making. So he says that we'll feel neutral. There won't be a tugging in either direction. We'll feel incredibly neutral about whether we take this job or the other job. Let's say it's job A and we want to take it and it seems right, and there's no pushing in either direction. Sometimes he just leaves that to us and he'll support us in it. It's not that it's a mystery treasure map that if we get it wrong, you're going to be in serious trouble. There are times that he just lets us move with what we know to be right or feel to be right, and then he supports us in that. And that's one of the things that, say, retreat time certainly does, and also throughout our lives, to work out vocationally the sort of person we are. As we know, as St. Paul says, there are many parts of one body. We need to find out what part we are in the sense of contributing to the community. God's made us in a certain way that we can contribute in a certain way, and then we value those and we make them accessible for the community to use. So You know, if I'm no good at music, I really shouldn't be running the choir.
Sure.
There are qualities. You might be good at listening. You might be good at hospitality. There are lots of it. I'm not just talking about the church buildings. I'm talking about the church community, the body of Christ itself, and listening to people. It might be along those lines that we have a particular quality, or we bring them into the fore, and that kind of helps us also make career choices, because God's not going to ask us something that won't fit the sort of person that He's made us to be. Because ultimately, the question we need to ask each day of our life, and particularly towards the end of the life, have I become the person You've created me to be? And that's kind of what we're doing all the time, discerning that, to see that we're becoming constantly the person that He wants us to be. And unless we've got a spiritual basis, all that sounds incredibly difficult. And so for the secular person, it's just not doable.
Makes sense.
As Christians, it is. It's something that we can do. It's something we should encourage each other to be able to do. There are ways of discerning, if we go down discerning methods, whether people are familiar with St. Ignatius's guide to decision making. There's a pretty good, there's podcasts and there's books by a priest called Timothy Gallagher, and he's probably the best presenter of the discernment method of Ignatius, and a lot of people I know have found that incredibly helpful. So he goes through things like, identifying the issues, then praying, spending some time, as Ignatius says, before God, and saying, look, is this a gift I want to give to you at the end of your life if you stand before Him? And he says, why have you chosen that? You're able to say from your heart why you did choose it, to pray with Scripture, to get informed about the decision, the specifics of it, to take it back to prayer. Obviously, you mentioned earlier in your introduction about you made a list of pros and cons. That's really important. And then you evaluate the effect it will have on other people as well as yourself. But you're, through this whole process, trying to notice the inner movements that go on. There are movements, as I said earlier, consolation or desolation, and they are the signs. If God's prompting you in a certain area, more often than not, you'll get consolation. Sometimes desolation will come in only because He's helping you move in another direction, but more often than not, there's consolation. We often put the name peace to that, the sense of peace. I do like the monastic way of doing it towards the end of this process is when you make a decision, or you think that you're going to choose to follow, say, path A, that you live it out for a week in your own mind. You don't tell everyone you're going to do it. You live it out simply. And then all the possible pros and cons will come back into play, and then it will either confirm or that you'll need to go back to the drawing board. But if you tell a lot of people, and I think you said that too in the introduction, if you tell a lot of people, they're likely to say, oh, if it was me, I'd do this. And as soon as you hear that, you don't follow it because it's not them. It's your heart. It's you know what I'm saying with that.
Yeah. Look, Dennis, there's a lot to unpackage there. We're about to go for our second break in a sec, but there's a lot to unpackage there because you talked a lot about the different parts and I suppose the different voices. And I know that the self, the ego, the I can play a lot of tricks. And you might think that that's a message from God to go in this direction, but it's actually I want. And you're sort of packaging it and telling people, oh, look, it's got to be the right decision because I had a dream and there was this coincidence that happened in front of me, and everywhere I looked, on a bus stop, a book, a movie, I'm seeing the same image over and over again.
Yep.
The dots are being joined. It's as clear as day. One of my dilemmas personally is I find when you know it's God, you actually don't need to tell anybody. You just know.
Yes, I agree.
And when you feel the compulsion to go screaming from rooftops, I've received a sign, I've received a sign, sometimes I find months later I speak to that person and say, well, what happened? Well, what happened to that direction you said you're going to take because you received a divine sign?
Yeah.
And I don't know what's happened to them. Dennis, we're going to have a short break in a minute, and I just wanted to pose to you the next question. It's a hypothetical. I come to you for a retreat. I'm at the crossroads about whether I don't know, you probably know the scenarios better than me. Maybe you can think of a hypothetical, a true story, obviously, but no names, of someone who's come to you at the crossroads for a retreat. And what panned out? What advice did you give and what happened? If you can think of any, just in the next couple of minutes, I'd love to hear a true story.
Okay.
Thank you.
I descend from a cloud where the air whistles loud, smiling green from below. Is this Eden's hello? How graceful I fall, like a raindrop unsold. Saw the sun in your face, I'm showered by rays. Sky blue and earth green, with no line in between. Vertigo heights, free falling for flight. See the fog rise beneath, from the stars they bequeath. As I hit sticks and stones, there are no broken bones.
Welcome back to Castanet for the last 15 minutes of our first ever program on Voice of Charity. Thank you for listening, dear listeners, and we've got a very special guest tonight, Denise Nichols, who lives the Benedictine way, and he's joining us tonight to talk about that age-old question, why do we say, "Dear Lord, give me a sign"? Dennis, I hope that music might have helped you think of maybe one true story or two of people who come to you on retreat over the last 45 years who were really struggling at the crossroads and trying to find a way out. Can you help us out?
There are a couple that that come to mind. One was a very simple one where, and of course it involved getting a sign for them. That came to mind fairly quickly. They were discerning a vocation and spent it was a few days really, just pondering and looking over their life, and eventually it came towards the end of the retreat, and they hadn't formed a decision at that point. So we went to the chapel and sat there and just invited him to open scripture. Now, some people will do that, but it can be misused. People can use it too much. We just said, pray for a while. He prayed for about a quarter of an hour. He opened scripture, and his eyes fell just on one section. As soon as the page opened, was you were a priest of the order of Melchizedek. And he looked up and he said, that's exactly it. He then went on, become a priest. He's been a priest now for 25 plus years and doing incredible work. But that was a pretty clear sign, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And that was one that he was seeking at that point. There's another story comes to mind of a young fellow that I will call him Ben for want of a better term, who had been involved with us for a while and had a pretty rugged existence, rugged life. He got involved in some, as a younger person, about 16, got involved with some fairly serious bad spiritual things. He'd been with the Ouija board, and after the event had happened, he mentioned how a spirit had actually gone into him. And that's why the church says don't get involved in any of that stuff for obvious reasons. You're opening a portal to spirits, bad spirits. It came into him. He got violent. He turned to drugs. It was incredible. It was overnight virtually. And then he used to often wander around. He was a bit like that Gerasene demoniac guy. People couldn't control him. The police were having difficulties controlling him, which is what often happens, unfortunately, with people who get caught up in some of the drug scene. And he was incredibly violent, angry, smashing things, the places he was in. You've got the picture. So obviously there was that, like the Gerasene demoniac, there was a spirit that was really pushing him. And I remember one time he used to give me a bit of a rough time because I had offered to support him where I could. A bit like the story of the father and the prodigal son, because he had no father, and he just needed an adult that would support him. He used to do that, and he would often ring and want some help, and my reactions were, it was very difficult at that time because of the violence. At any rate, one night he rang and he wanted to see me, and so I said, yeah, all right. So I went to see him, and he was very different, and we went and had a pizza, and he's sitting there with a big smile on his face. I hadn't seen him smile for a couple of years, and I said to him, what's this about? What's happened? He said, I got to the late at night, and he says, I was going to kill myself, but there's no one there to support me, and I remember you were the only one that would support me. And he said, I tried to get through, and I couldn't get through to you on your phone. And he said, I decided to kill myself, so I got the needle and about to jab it in my arm. He said, I remember what you said. I said, what did I say? He said, if you ever feel that bad, call on God. And I said, what happened? He said, I did. I said, and? He said, God said, I said, what did you say? He said, are you there, God? And he said, God said, yeah,
Are you
quite
there,
clearly.
God?
Are you there, God? Yeah, it's extraordinary. Yeah. And I said, yeah, I was laughing at the time. I'm not laughing at him, but laughing with him because it was so out of character for him, but it was his desperation. It was his last thing. And then God responded to him. And I said, what did he say? Because I wanted to check whether it was his ego, if you like, or whether, in fact, it was the Spirit of God. And it was the Spirit of God. It was really clear. Because what happened was, he said, God said, Ben, we call him Ben, Ben, I've been with you all this time. What can I do for you? And when I heard him say, what can I do for you? I knew it was Jesus of the gospel. Because normally, when people have been through that, they would imagine God would say, you've been very bad, you're in a lot of trouble. And it didn't happen that way. It happened the other way. And Ben said to him, I want to be healed of all this, take away this drugs and take away the spirit that entered me during that time. And he said he felt incredible heat went from his head to his toes. And it just washed him away. From that day onwards, he never touched drugs again. He then asked to be accepted into the church and to spend time in prayer. So we spent time praying. And extraordinary change of his life. a really, really good man. And, the story continues, but it's a long story, and I don't think I've got time for the rest of it. But the signs were there, and they were genuine signs that God can speak to us quite clearly at times, and he felt that in his heart. And he had no precedence. There was no religious people in his family suggesting this should happen. It just came from his own experience of encountering God and asking for his presence. So that's probably not the norm, but it does show how much the Lord cares, obviously, and will step in if people ask. So when we're at the end of our tether, it doesn't hurt to ask him to help.
But to hear his voice, though, Dennis, and thank you for sharing those two beautiful testimonies, but to hear his voice, it goes back to something you said at the beginning, going back to stillness and silence in order to hear his voice and not our own. I know there are other voices and there's internet and there's Google, but the one I worry about is the ego, the self, because it can really play tricks. And you'll hear a very distinct, beautiful voice that says, go this direction, but it's actually just yourself. And sometimes we can maybe, we can decorate something as divine, but it's actually just the self.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Well, we'll go back to Ignatius if I can, and he talks about the discernment, which I think was one of the words we were working on tonight, what discernment is, to get that understanding, that pondering, if you like, that differentiation between what's the right spirit. So discernment is about understanding which spirit is motivating us. You suggested in the case you just outlined, it would be the personal spirit, the ego. The Holy Spirit will motivate us in a different way or affect us in a different way. So one of the images that, and I like it, that Ignatius uses is there's a test, if you like. First of all, he's quite happy to test God. He says sometimes when you made a decision, you can ask God to confirm that decision. And that is important. But one of the other things he does, he says, let's look at the before, the middle, and the end of your prayer time. So you're sitting there, I'll give you an example, and you've decided that you're going to read at church, and then you think, oh, this would be really good, I'll do that. You get up and you make the decision, feel this is from God, obviously, I'll ring the priest and I'll get involved and put my name down as a reader. So that sounds good on the surface. He says, check the beginning, the middle, and the end. And what he's looking for, he calls it the tail of the snake. It's a ripper. He talks about he talks about the tail of the snake in terms of, obviously, the snake being Satan or the voice that's not quite right. So as soon as you hear the voice that's not quite right, the whole thing's out of whack. If it's from the Lord, it'll be right. I'll give you an example on the same thing. So the person sitting there praying about what I should do, they hear this thing about, why don't you become a reader at the church? Okay, that sounds good. Yep, could do that. It's contributing to the community. So it ticks the first one. That's how it started. The middle one is, what's my reading like? Can I read? Yeah, I can do that. And then the end of it, you say to yourself, people think I'm pretty good because I can get up there and read. I can read really well. I can read better than some of the other people. In fact, I can show the others how they should be reading. As soon as you hear that, that's the tail of the snake. Because you put your ego forward. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense because, funnily enough, Dennis, I sort of prepared a whole lot of prompts and questions for this, and this has been a really beautiful segue into one of the last points I was going to make. And it's more of a question for both of us, I suppose, and for our listeners. And that is, are we asking the wrong question? Rather than asking God for a sign about what's best for me, what decision will I make that we won't regret? Maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question needs to be selfless and more along the lines of, you've given me life. What do you want me to do? Use me as a vessel towards whatever you like, and be a lot more, and here's another word you use at the beginning, a lot more obedient. And I wonder at times whether maybe, without even realizing it, we've been asking the wrong question.
Yes, very good. I mean, that fits in with that ego drama, theo drama principle. Where the ego drama, as we're talking about, is about me, and I'm the centre of everything. Theo drama, which you've described beautifully, is about God, and God's invited us to be part of that. He allows us to become the person He's made us to be. But we want to be in tune with that. And the best way is through listening, through prayer, through obedience. Obedience, unfortunately, that would be a whole segment.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people confuse obedience with doormat stuff or doing what you're told. And that's not necessarily it. Well, it's not it. Obedience comes from the word listening and attentive. If you're attentive and are listening, you'll act on that listening. And that's what obedience is. You've been listening properly. So therefore, when we're making decisions, we listen. And who are we listening to? You're saying there, the trouble is we might be listening to ourselves and what our own desires are. But maybe we can listen to the Lord more, and those around us, what our decisions will, those that our decisions will affect, we have to listen to them. But that we listen and be attentive to it, and then be obedient to that. And trying that test of the tail of the snake is, I think, a really valuable one. Because if the three line up, so let's go back to that particular person again who's going to read, and we'll line them up rather than have the tail of the snake. How it would line up would be, I feel in my spirit I'd like to read. There's a call that I'd like to serve the community this way. I think I can read. I might be a bit embarrassed when I get up there, but it doesn't matter. That's okay. I'm doing it for the Lord, not for anyone else and not for myself. And the third one is, it will really help me prepare the readings and reflect on them each week. And they'll mean a lot more to me too, and to others that I'm reading it to. Those three tick the boxes. Therefore, you can say safely that it probably comes from the Lord.
I like that. It's another wonderful segue, Dennis, because you've talked about the snake and the tail of the snake, and you've talked about the three. I'm sort of listening to you and thinking of the letter S again, but a different three things, and that is sacrifice, selfless, and sign. Maybe that's the sort of thing we should be looking for. I'll give you a quick example. A person's trying to choose between two careers, two jobs, and they're weighing them up, in terms of pay and distance and promotional opportunities and what doors it will open and the work culture, etc.
Yep.
But almost all of those things are to do with our comfort. What's going to be pleasing to me? Now, if you flip that and say, dear Lord, what would you like me to do? It sort of reminds me of the anecdote you gave before about the person who said, hey, God, are you out there? And even with kids, sometimes people treat prayer like a one-way phone call. You dial the number, you pass on your message, thank you, sorry, please, bye for now. What about listening to the response? We've hung up the phone before we actually heard the response.
Yes.
And sometimes you've got to wait, because there could be a long, pregnant pause before we go into that listening. Again, one of those things that you mentioned at the beginning. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, very much so. And even you're talking about career changes too, but we don't want to knock the finances and knock all the things that people need. That's important. In fact, Francis de Sales in Introductions of Outlife pushes really strongly that we have a duty to our state of life first. So if you've got family to support, all those elements are necessary. But when you put that, you marry it with the concepts that Therese has with the little way is trusting that God is our Father and that all things will be used for good. And so we desire and we allow our hearts to follow the way the Father leads us.
Yeah.
And no matter what happens, He'll lead it towards the good.
Perfect.
De Coursard talks about abandoning ourselves to the divine providence.
Exactly. Dennis, our hour together has flown, and the fact that we want to keep talking shows you how enriching this has been. God bless you, Dennis. Thank you so much for gracing us as our first guest on Cast the Net here on Voice of Charity. Hope to get you back again soon, and have a beautiful evening.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Thank you, dear listeners, for listening. Thank you, John, in the studio, and thank you. Until next fortnight, we'll be back again with Cast the Net. God bless you.
as I prepare my catch. I stare at my reflection when I should meet my match. You saw me searching barren places. You saw me wage with my last coin. You saw the joy